This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. I have been arguing for years now that we are living in an age of hysteria in the United States. But my guest this week has argued that the United States has always been a nation of hysteria and moral panics and conspiracy theories. Unfortunately, I think he might be right. This is my interview with Jesse Walker. I am joined from outside Baltimore, Maryland by a good friend of mine, Jesse Walker of Reason Magazine and Reason.com, who I've known for 10 years now. And he was the first person to, in the mainstream media, if you can call Reason mainstream, which I do, to care about my book, Renegade History of the United States. And he wrote a fantastic, well, we did an interview, and then you did an interview of me, and there was sort of a review of it, but you're the reason you're the reason that anybody knows about me, Jesse. So I am eternally grateful to you.
Well, and you then introduced me to your agent, and he sold my book, so it worked out well.
Yeah, we've had a very good collaboration over the last decade. So I've been wanting to have you on for several months now because you are the man to talk to about, what do we want to call it? Moral panics, conspiracy theories, general hysterias in American politics. And you wrote this fantastic book called The United States of Paranoia, which we just mentioned. But, you know, I actually wanted to, this conversation we're about to have actually stems from a very brief Twitter exchange you and I had about 5 years ago. I don't know if you remember it, but I tweeted out during, I think it was either the race hysteria on college campuses or the sexual assault hysteria on college campuses. I just said on Twitter, America is a nation of hysterias. And you tweeted back at me, hasn't it always been? Or isn't it always? And I thought, oh, Jesse just wrote a book in which he argues that it's always been central in American politics, of course. And I have been thinking about that ever since. And I think you're right. But I want to talk about this. Conspiracy theories, hysterias, moral panics, you argue in that book, go all the way back to before the founding and have, more importantly, and we'll get into the meat of the argument in a second, you argue that it's not been just fringe groups peddling conspiracy theories. In fact, you say it's been squarely in the mainstream of American politics since the very beginning. So it's a very provocative thesis I want to get into. But I guess I want to, and this is this book's been out for a while. This is nothing new, but it's time to revisit it. And I'm sorry to make you talk about it once again, but you are at least talking to a professional historian this time. So I actually wanted to ask you, back in 2013, well, that's when it was published, but before then, like, why did you write that book? What was it about the paranoid style or the conspiracy theory propensity among Americans that made you write that book?
Well, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I was sort of writing the book before I realized I was writing a book. I mean, I had been writing a bunch of articles going back to the mid-1990s. I mean, the oldest material in the book is some stuff I recycled from a magazine article I did in 95 or 96. And by recycle, I mean, there are quotes in there from interviews I did for that piece back then. So and I didn't sort of, so I had been sort of marinating in these ideas and this topic for a long time. And part of the process of figuring out that it was a book was figuring out that different things that interested me were the same thing, or were at least connected. You know, that when I was interested in just sort of the interesting mythologies and folklore of people on the what people call the fringes of American politics, and when I was interested in sort of mainstream moral panics, and even when I was interested in things like popular misconceptions about how people behave during natural disasters, that these were all kind of linked in interesting ways, and that there was a history to this. So I mean, my interest in conspiracy theories goes back to my teens. You know, I certainly wasn't. I'm leaping out of the middle of one answer to say something else.
No, it's good.
But because I got interested, I was always someone who, if I was interested in a subject, I would be interested in. I grew up in North Carolina, basketball everywhere, so I read about basketball history. I mean, everything was. I mean, that's just part of how I process things. And I got interested in. I don't remember what first got me into it, but like the the misbehavior of the CIA, the FBI, the national security state. So I went to start reading about, the Pike Commission, the Church Committee, the mid-1970s investigations that exposed a lot of like these very real conspiracies. And when you do that, especially if, I was in a college town, I was going to a college library at UNC, and you go to the shelf, and they've got a lot of books, and the books that are reliable are on the same shelf as these books that are maybe a little bit more strange in their claims, or go a bit beyond the evidence. And I'm reading those too. And at first, I'm not entirely discerning, as I should be about what's reliable and what's not. And over time, some things become clear that this. Those photographs of the tramps that they arrested at Dealey Plaza really don't look like E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis, even if you squint, But it's but there. So it was, and in fact, there was a book. I really wish I could remember the title of the book. I would have loved to have mentioned this in my book if I could have found it again. But it was just this anthology of people writing. I mean, mostly sort of new left type people writing about the government misbehavior of this kind. And I remember and I can think back to what I found plausible, and then I finally hit the one where I say, all right, now you sound like a schizophrenic. And the stuff I found plausible was Kennedy assassination, oh, maybe. I mean, I'm not a Kennedy believer, but nowadays, but then I said, well, it could be true, King assassination, maybe. But then I got to this one where they said, they're going to have cameras on every street corner watching your every move, everyone in the country. And I'm like, this is insane. Why would they care about everyone in the country? I'm not. And so of course, that's the one that turns out to be, absolutely correct. And that's humbling to know that the guy who sounds like the schizophrenic might be the right one. And meanwhile, the person who's saying this stuff that sounds sort of plausible about ballistics in Dallas, might actually be a nut. So first, now what was your question? I went off on a tangent within a tangent.
I don't care anymore. This is so good. For most of 2020, Paloma Verde CBD has been the sponsor of the Unregistered podcast, and I couldn't be prouder. They are an independent, family-owned entrepreneurial business based in San Antonio, Texas, owned and operated by the couple Vanessa and Carlos Avalar. And their products are fantastic. They approached me to be a sponsor many months ago, and I told them to send me some samples, and I tried them, and I have loved them all, and I've become a daily user of Paloma Verde CBD products. Now, the best thing for you all and all of us is that they are offering unregistered listeners 25% off of all of their products if you go to palomaverdestore.com and use the discount code RENEGADE. Also, Vanessa and Carlos have put together my very favorite 3 Paloma Verde products, which are their gummies, which come in multiple flavors, which I love. Tastes like candy, better than candy actually, and I eat them way too often. But they have 10 milligrams of CBD in each gummy. There's soft gels, which I use 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a day. And these have also 10 milligrams per soft gel. And then my favorite thing, though, is the tincture, because it's fast acting. You put this under your tongue, and your anxiety and your insomnia issues will go away pretty quickly, I have found. Those 3 products are packaged under what's called the Unregistered Combo Pack, also known as the THAD Pack. To get the THAD Pack, you get 33% off. Go to Paloma Verde store. I forgot to mention one thing. If you join their mailing list, you get another 10% off. So that would be 35% off. It's your first order anything. 43% off the combo pack, the THAD Pack. Go to palomaverdestore.com. Use the discount code RENEGADE. Get some incredible products that are going to make you better, make you happier, and I thank you.
But you were asking. I remember you were asking me how I decided to.
Yeah, you're answering it. Yeah, you're answering it.
Yeah. So I mean, it became clear that there was sort of a history to this, and also that it really was just more common, and it was. It's not just that it was more common than people expect, because usually if I tell people it's not the far left or just the far left or the far right, it's the mainstream, and someone who's around you or my age, someone who was alive in the 1980s, I can say, do you remember the Satanic Panic? Mm-hmm. And chances are, if you're that age, people remember it, and they say, oh yeah, completely mainstream media were telling these stories that in retrospect were completely insane. I mean, these claims that could not be backed up about people this vast network of satanic cults molesting kids, in some versions of the story, which was on 2020, so very mainstream, sacrificing kids, and it being taken seriously enough that people went to jail for long stretches. In some cases, were not let out until decades later, with an apology. And people say, yeah, and that was mainstream, right? And so that then, but then you have to then say, well, look at what's happening now that might be something similar to that. And also, you have kind of, how does that jump from because in the 1970s, some of those stories were being told in sort of extremist, I hate the word extremist, but people would say extremist evangelical Christian communities and so on. How does that make the jump that suddenly in the 1980s, someone who 10 years earlier had been traveling the Christian coffee house circuit, claiming to be a defector from the Illuminati who had worshipped Satan, and this is what he knew about the Great Conspiracy. He then pops up on that same episode of 2020, not talking about the Illuminati, but showing this is the artifacts, or not artifacts, the sort of paraphernalia that a Satanist would use in his rituals. That's kind of interesting. And then this person is eventually exposed, as you would expect, as being a fraud a few years after that. How does that sort of transit from one to the other happen? What has to happen on a social level that more people are open to those kinds of stories? So, I mean, I will say that by the time I sat down to write the book, I had a pretty good sense of the answers to those questions, and what the book was going to say, because I had been sort of working on it for more than 10 years without realizing I was working on it. The book itself I wrote very quickly, in about a year and a half.
Yeah.
I mean, by from having a contract to turning it in.
Believe me, I know that's very fast. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I was able to do that because I had been sort of swimming in this stuff for so long that I had already made a lot of those connections.
Isn't the original origin of this your fascination? You sort of mentioned this already. I think Nick Gillespie has described you as a walking encyclopedia of fringe radical movements. And I think that's basically true. I mean, I've read your stuff a lot, and you do. I think you're the only person, and I mean this. You might be, I would say, the only person in the United States who knows more about radical, especially left-wing fringe movements than I do. But
I'm sure there are more than you and me, but yeah, I do have. I have this. I am the person on the Reason staff that when they had a bit of art for a story about the new nationalism, and the art was supposed to be suggestive of fascism. They wanted me to look at it to make sure that they weren't accidentally using the actual symbols of some fascist group. And not that I would know, because there's so thousands of, but I was like the most likely to recognize something like that.
Now,
but,
when you were in high school, and we will definitely get to the book and back to the book in a second, but when you were in high school and college, when you were a young adult becoming political, there's also a rumor that you were a left winger back then. Is that true?
It's true.
Oh, it is true. Okay, I wasn't clear about that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I grew up in a college town, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So fairly. I mean, I thought of it as a liberal town until I then went to school in Ann Arbor and found what like an actual left-wing town was like.
That's right.
But surrounded by a mostly conservative state. Sends Jesse Helms to the Senate, and we were kind of in the shadow of Jim Baker. Like I guess he's back, sort of famous again now, semi-famous. So it was very easy for me, as someone who was kind of anti-authoritarian, to be reacting against that sort of thing. And I actually, by the end of high school, I was reading libertarian material and being kind of, as someone who had been very much a civil libertarian, very much anti-war, sort of very extreme on the spectrum of tolerance, but had, was sort of like reflexively sort of a traditional left-wing views of economics. And, I didn't start reading these things and say, all right, well, this is a much more plausible argument. I haven't really thought of this before, and you're making good points. But I still thought of myself as being a leftist, a radical leftist, who was a sort of, incorporating these free market thoughts. And what made me sort of reconsider my place on the spectrum was then going to a city surrounded by actual radical leftists and finding that, the stuff that I assumed they would have in common with me about, censorship and stuff like that was not, in fact, in common with me. I did not then identify with the right. But at first I was trying to sort of see myself as being kind of a true left or whatever, but that's sort of a waste of time. I sort of feel like, some people talk with me and they figure I'm on the left. Some people figure I'm on the right. Everyone has their own version of what the political spectrum looks like. It's not worth arguing about, because it's stupid to try to fit politics onto a single dimension or even the two-dimensional map,
Yeah.
We're in this kind of hyperlinked universe where everything is adjacent to everything else.
Yeah.
I've seen people try to mix Rothbardian libertarianism with Maoism. And once you have seen someone try to make that combination, you realize people can try to combine anything they want. And Stephen Hallbrook, who is now like kind of a famous gun rights guy, when he was young, he wrote a piece called Mao, Economy, and State in a libertarian magazine called Outlook. And he had another piece in another libertarian magazine. And it wasn't just him. When he did the Mao, Economy, and State, they got Carl Hess to write an intro, which was sort of like, I don't know, but at least pay attention, guys. Don't be put off by this. Leonard Liggio, who later ran the Mont Pelerin Society, kind of got swayed by Hallbrookian arguments, because Liggio was in his sort of libertarian New Left phase then. So there's like about 3 or 4 people. It's not a very big group, but the fact that anyone was willing to try to make that combination means that you can, it's pointless to try to do a one-dimensional thing.
I've always thought, so first of all, I've said this publicly, I'll say it again, that Reason is by far the closest media outlet to my political views as there is out there. But I think even within Reason, I think among the staff at Reason, it's probably you and Nick who are the closest to my politics. Or I would say my sensibility. There's a sensibility that I find especially in you, that's like, you do seem like an ex-leftist just like me. And I'm not even sure I can put my finger on what that means. But the way that you write about politics, the questions you're interested in, like this recent, really fantastic review of this book that it's a completely academic book, but everyone should read it, about after the Haitian Revolution, and about how large portions of Haiti were basically ungoverned, sort of anarchist pirate colonies. And it's a wonderful, wonderful review of, apparently, and it's a scholarly book, but it's a total Jesse Walker article. And I think that your interest in what, and we talked about this in our interview 10 years ago, the term subaltern that academics basically coined, I believe, meaning the power, the people who are outside of formal power, they have no institutional power. You're very interested in them, it seems, right? And more so than your typical libertarians. I'd say most libertarians, virtually anyone on the right. I think that sets you apart. Do you agree?
I'm perhaps. I mean, one difference between you and me, because I understand like the kind of common sensibilities. I don't think of myself as an ex-leftist, and I don't think of myself as a leftist either. I just sort of figure like I left that kind of argument about whether I'm left or right behind. Almost. You know, it's kind of like I don't. I can keep a foot in there if I want, if they're willing to have me. But I'm going to write for conservative magazines too, if they'll have me, even though I'm obviously not a conservative.
Right.
It's just kind of like extend a hand of friendship to whoever wants to talk with you and is worth talking with.
No, but what I was getting at, sorry to cut you off.
Yeah. So I mean, the sort of interest in what happens outside. I guess actually a difference between my view and a lot of sort of typical political views is I don't consider who happens to be president to be the most important fact, and right. And I don't consider even, you know, which party. Obviously, this is determines a lot of policies and it reflects a lot. But I mean, I enjoy just on the level of it's clear that every event has lots of causes and there's lots going on that's not sort of captured by these sort of standard categories, and certainly not the sort of standard political parties. And a lot of what we sort of think we're watching, because we have a two-party system, people think of there being these two Americas, and in fact, there's many more than two Americas. But it's not like they're all separate; they all overlap and flow into each other. Mm-hmm. And then when you start looking at the interstices where they flow into each other, that's when you find things like these, you know, maroon colonies in Haiti that were in the article. So that's. I don't know. I mean, how it compares to other libertarians. Doug Henwood, who I know was on this show a month or two ago,
who's a Marxist, socialist.
Yeah. But who I've been. My first book is about radio, and I've known him since like the '90s, because he was involved with Pacifica, and I was writing about Pacifica, and we were kind of. I've never met him face to face, but we've had like friendly exchanges for like almost 25 years. But he made some comment on Twitter about me being like an unusual libertarian, and I told him I was the one true libertarian and everyone else was a heretic, you know?
Yeah.
Because I figure I work for a reason, so by definition, what I do is libertarian. I don't know. I guess I've probably answered your question in there. I guess if you want to ask like what I'm sort of different from like the standard libertarian approach to the world, I never went through an Ayn Rand phase. I never had that sort of notion that you have like one sort of you can like deduce like an entire social worldview from one or two precepts and then like to sort of apply it rigidly. I don't find that. I think it's useful to do that exercise in a way. Like, I mean, like I find it. I enjoy reading, you know, Murray Rothbard sort of deduce like what his libertarian law code would look like. It's a sort of very interesting sort of logical exercise and makes good points along the way. But you know, that's my view of reality is just kind of too messy for that. I guess there's just sort of a different basis for my libertarian outlook.
Well, you reminded me. You reminded me of your other book, which is really about the cultural fringe in American society, or a cultural fringe, which was pirate radio. Did you also write about college radio stations in that book? Or
there's some about college radio. There's a lot about community radio, by which I mean sort of not commercial stations, but not traditional public stations either. Right. You know, early amateur radio, like back when, because amateurs invented broadcasting before there was commercial radio. And then they created the special amateur licenses, which included a whole list of stuff that you weren't allowed to do as a ham radio operator, which were all the sorts of things that broadcasters did. So it became this different category. but it was actually these kids, who were building their own radio kits, who were inventing broadcasting at a time when people assumed that, when the mainstream assumed that radio technology would just be used for like ship to ship, ship to shore, point to point communication. They got their hands on this technology, and often just for the fun of it. At first they weren't even getting a profit motive. They built this whole world, and started negotiating sort of very elaborate covenants with each other about how they would divvy up the airwaves, and they would get into fights with the Navy operators about who had the right to be transmitting a particular signal at a particular time. So yeah, that book goes from there up through, the book came out in 2001. It came out like a week or two before 9/11. So you can imagine it got a lot of attention when it came out.
Do you know when my first book on Jimmy Hoffa came out?
2003 or so, wasn't it?
The publication date, Jesse Walker, is September 11th, 2001.
Oh my goodness. All right. Well, my pain then.
Yeah.
You had it even worse than me then.
It was incredible. It was incredible.
Yeah.
It was still reviewed in the
You were lucky to get that New York Times review then. That's we were talking before this about about popping up in the New York Times. They took note of it.
A review by a guy, a three-page center spread review by a professor of history who did not read the book, but yeah, I'll take whatever I can get. So libertarians, who I would call right libertarians or conservative libertarians, or really most libertarians and hardly anyone on the right, would take interest in, these college kids creating this sort of pirate economy, pirate form of cultural transmission, these new radio stations. I love that stuff. And it's not, and the greatest thing about your argument there, I think, is you're not just finding sort of interesting arcana. You're making an argument that was the origin of something much, much bigger and very important in American culture, right?
Yeah. And it's, and I guess the way I've often described that book as being about a history of people trying to do creative things with radio, and the history of the barriers that were put in their ways by state and corporate institutions, but especially state institutions, because they, created created the framework for that corporate oligopoly. So a lot of it is happening on the fringe, although it often will have a strong impact on people's, ordinary people's lives if they get called into it. But they invented a lot of things that we take for granted in the mainstream now, and that people have reinvented, on the internet. Social media is just, if you read about what ham radio operators were doing in the Woodrow Wilson administration, it sounds a lot like what trolls were doing on the internet.
So let's pivot to your book, and I need you to know that I was a Richard Hofstadter Presidential Fellow at Columbia University. That was the name of the fellowship they gave it to graduate students in U.S. history at Columbia. Richard Hofstadter is probably still arguably the most famous U.S. historian in our field, and he wrote a very important book called The Paranoid Style in American Politics, which your book, in some ways, is sort of an extended critique of it. You do a whole lot more than Hofstadter did. He kind of put forward a theory, and you actually wrote an entire history of the paranoid style in America, and you challenged a couple of his major theses, but you also embraced a couple of his important theses too. But let's talk about Hofstadter for a second here. We all had to read him, and he had several very important books that he wrote, and this was one that was generally considered probably his less persuasive. But can you give us a capsule summary of that book, and what about it that you found both problematic and enlightening?
Yeah, so the book is sort of built around the essay, The Paranoid Style in American History, which actually the lecture that became that he delivered, you might not know this, in Great Britain the day before John F. Kennedy was shot.
Oh my God.
So there's like a twofer origin story for you right there.
Whoa.
Yeah, so he kind of gives, and that essay, which then, I mean, he then revised it in Harper's, and then he revised it for the book. And the book, he put it in with all these sort of related essays on related themes. But I mean, the key idea is that American, he goes back to, I think the earliest one he looks at was the Illuminati scare of the 1790s. So he does not go all the way back to the American Revolution, which would be problematic for him if he had. We could get into why. But he sort of, he sees this history of, he goes through several scares, and he lists sort of these characteristics of what he calls the paranoid style. So he's looking at mostly oppositional groups, and when he looks at it at an elite, he's able to sort of do it in the framework of people who are thinking about, elites in decline and their status anxiety. This would be the Federalists in the 1790s. And he describes this sort of paranoid style as one of being of minority movements. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of the big thing I challenge. I mean, there are a couple bits of his essays which I say, yeah, you're right. I mean, he has some valuable things to say about sort of the figure of the defector who comes forward and claims to have been, like a part of the conspiracy of Freemasons or Mormons or whichever group it is, and we're going to give you the inside scoop. He has some valuable things to say about sort of the role of projection, which is sort of like helps explain why John Bircher sort of built this elaborate hierarchy that mimics the way they saw the communist hierarchy in America, or Ku Klux Klansmen sort of doing this almost minstrel show version of what they saw as like the Vatican hierarchies. But where he really goes astray, in my view, is he not just as of minority movements, but as this sort of thing that sort of periodically sort of flares up in these examples. Whereas I say it as something that it's in every single example that he looks at, I mean, I don't have it in front of me, people on the side of that conflict and talk about the conspiracy theories that they had. I mean, Hofstadter is sort of famous for going after the populists, or infamous because so much of what he said has been disproven by later historians. But if you look at the people who the populists were against, so sort of the northeastern elites that they saw as sucking dry the farmers out west and so on, they had these elaborate conspiracy theories about who was behind the populists, what they were up to. Some of them saying there might be a foreign conspiracy. People think of the populists as anti-Semitic, and in many cases they were. But I mean, these folks on the other side could be incredibly anti-Semitic. I mean, that was kind of common in American society at that time. And so Hofstadter really just sort of didn't give the full due to how much this permeates American society. And I think that partly had to do with kind of, he's writing in the early 1960s at the time where the sort of, I mean, he had been a former Marxist, but he was now sort of in this sort of center-left place where people were, worried about the radical right. And then sort of more broadly, he's part of that moment where, after World War II, where people sort of associate, the mob. I don't know that he uses that kind of language, but, he's part of this crowd of people who are like worried about the unchecked passions of sort of basically, democracy leading to fascism if it's, if it's not ultimately, if it's not checked by these other forces. And then there's like a whole bunch of writers kind of in that vein at that time, and Hofstadter fits into that really well, and in a way that's kind of uncomfortable now to read. And I think he kind of fell out of favor, I mean, decades later, as people started, after the New Left and the counterculture and people sort of getting more interested in like what you were calling the subaltern. I'm like sort of realizing how much, Hofstadter was perspective that doesn't have just room for this, these parts of American society. And there was actually sort of a wave of people in the 1990s and the early aughts who were rejecting Hofstadter's ideas about the paranoid style. Writers like Peter Knight, Mark Fenster, who wrote very good books that really trounced Hofstadter, but were not widely read. So that when I sit down to write this book, I can cite them, but I have to kind of start again by saying, this is what Hofstadter said, and this because Hofstadter is the guy everybody name drops. during the whole Tea Party wave, I mean, there were all these editorials where people just sort of say there is a paranoid style in American politics, as Richard Hofstadter wrote, and I think half of them hadn't read the essay, but even the ones who had, I don't think they read anything that had been written since then, you know?
Yeah. So Hofstadter was a liberal by the time of the 50s and 60s, and most of us read that book as, in fact, he doesn't even directly address it, does he? But it was a sort of a veiled attack on McCarthyism, wasn't it? I mean,
well, yeah, I mean, he was part of that, and this kind of was what I was getting at earlier. He saw this sort of he saw the McCarthyists as sort of the natural heirs to the populists, and saw one as leading to another. Mm-hmm. And then later, Michael Paul Rogan sort of looked at like the voting patterns in Wisconsin and showed, well, yes, this had been a strong point of, in that case, not populism, but sort of the Midwestern progressive tradition that he also had as part of that continuum. But these votes, and then also McCarthy, these votes were coming from different people. You know, you don't, one is not a natural sequel to the other. I think Rogan took that a little too far, because it's then interesting to me that Wisconsin would be a hotbed of vote. You know, like, what is it about the political culture of the upper Midwest that there are some shared assumptions, which often come out in arguments about foreign policy and so on. But even so, yeah, I mean, that's part of where Hofstadter was coming from. He would often use the word pseudo-conservative to describe, you know, McCarthy and others in that sort of vein.
And he was.
I'm sorry, you were heading somewhere with.
No. And he was also. I'm just going to add on to this. And he was also a professor, a famous professor at an Ivy League university in Manhattan, in New York City. And so he tended to say in his book, or he pretty much only said, that the paranoid style was exclusive to right-wing bumpkin types. So he was interested in the Ku Klux Klan. He was interested in the populists, people who come out of sort of the middle, what we now call flyover country, which was back then just sort of like the non-elite part of the United States. So I mean, you know, that's another big part of the problem. And you begin your book with a very extensive cataloging of very elaborate conspiracy theories that actually often led to violence among Congress people and politicians all the way back to the 19th century, maybe even earlier. And so, I mean, that's you really go after him there. But it was very much an elitist, what we would now call like a bicoastal elite attitude about this thing. And you're saying
he does mention the radical left having conspiracy theories, but he does not focus on it in the in the essay. He really does. And I mean, the leftists who he does discuss, the populists, he doesn't discuss as though they're leftists, you know, because that's not how he saw the populist part.
Right, because they're the bad leftists, or they're the leftists who went awry. I mean, there's so much that is reminiscent of what's going on today, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch here that sounds very similar to what's happening. I mean, the whole Trump phenomenon, which we can talk about later, but like, and how they're prone to conspiracy theories. And of course, they're a bunch of bumpkins. And then the Trump people say that the left is now full of conspiracy theories for other reasons, because they're elitists. But it's very much the same. It's very much the same kind of fight going on. So let's do the history, okay? Because you write in your book, you make a very serious claim, my friend. I'm going to quote you. You say, "In America, it is always a paranoid time." And you also say that conspiracy theories are, quote, at the country's core.
Yes.
So again, as I said this before, you know, from the beginning, from before the founding to the present day, you're saying that this kind of thinking, or one might say this impulse, has been rife and throughout society, across class, across race, across ethnicity. It's hard to find a major social group in the United States that has not at some point or another entertained a fairly wild conspiracy theory, right? Is that your argument?
I would go further. It's not just the United States, because I wrote this to use that prism to look at the United States, but I explicitly say I'm not making any kind of exceptionalist argument here. I do not think that America is, you know, more paranoid than the Middle East or Brazil or Russia or wherever, you know.
Okay.
I don't know how you would do a comparative study, but some places are famous for having lots of conspiracy theories. But I'm sure the ones that aren't I'm sure that Finland has tons of conspiracy theories that I know nothing about.
I wonder.
And so I mean, I think this is part of how people perceive the world. I mean, we are a sort of storytelling, pattern finding animal. We naturally try to, fill in the gaps, in whatever gaps in the data we have in speculation. And because we're afraid of things, sometimes rationally afraid, sometimes not rationally afraid, we're going to sometimes fill in the gaps with scary things, which will often take the forms of conspiracies. And when you add to that the fact that sometimes conspiracies really do exist, it's not like I often tell people, it's not like you're afraid of vampires and eventually you will notice that no vampires show up. Whereas, if you're afraid of conspiracies, well, eventually you open the newspaper and, Snowden is revealing the NSA is spying on all these people,
Right.
So that tends to reinforce rather than dissipate. So that means that there's always going to be conspiracy theories anywhere that society exists. I mean, it's just part of being a social animal, I think.
You think?
So yeah, so I think that to me, like with this book, it's just like if you assume that, what does American history look like? Because that's going to manifest itself differently in different cultures. So how does that manifest itself in American culture, and across American history? And in my view, it becomes like a really interesting, lens just to look at things. You see new things about the Civil War, the labor battles of the 19th century, the Indian Wars, the Cold War. If you're looking at it as like what were people afraid of and what stories did they tell? And there's and if a story catches on, that means that it has an impact whether or not it's true. I mean, that's just the way it is with the stories people tell one another. So, even conspiracy theories that are false, when they catch on, they can become a really important part of American history, and sometimes have a real. I mean, the first Confederation of English colonies in America was formed. The New England Confederation was formed after the Pequot War, in part because of some dubious fears of Indian conspiracies, and they felt they needed to band together. That is, in some ways, the first precursor to the United States. The first time they said, like, let's get some of these colonies together. When the United States itself was formed, they did so with a conspiracy tract called the Declaration of Independence, which doesn't just list a whole bunch of grievances against the king, but says this is part of, I don't have the text in front of me, but the language is something like, a design, a plan. I mean, there was sort of seen by the founding fathers as an English plan to reduce people to subservience, and in the more extreme rhetoric to slavery. Someone, I think it was Washington, I actually had a direct, there's that famous line someone says about cries of liberty from the people who are the drivers of Negroes, and Washington, I think it was Washington, has the quote where he says they want to rule us like the blacks over which we hold sway, or some phrase like that. So it's very interesting telling. So I mean, this is just it has to be, and that's part of why I said earlier it would change Hofstadter's essay if he had gone back to the American Revolution. Some of the first critiques of it were from people, who were then saying, well, look at Bernard Bailyn, this work showing all the conspiracy theories in the American Revolution. Doesn't that kind of say this was more mainstream than Hofstadter was, suggesting in his piece?
Absolutely. Let's go to let's talk about the most famous conspiracy theory, I guess, still in American history, the Salem witch trials, right? So what do you when I was in grad school, we did a whole section on this because that was in the 90s. I don't even know how many books there are now, but at that point there were 5 to 6, not just books, but whole schools of thought explaining the Salem witch trials, because no one, of course, took it seriously on its own terms. And there were all kinds of explanations for the Salem witch trials, some having to do with gender, some having to do with class. People, there was a famous argument made, I forget which historian, that it was basically people who were declining in class status, who were reacting against people they perceived to be rising in class status, that they were accusing of being witches. But what's your take on it? And what's, I mean, by the way, I want to say this. I mean, there's no way to prove this, and I may very well be wrong, but I do think there is something a bit exceptional about American conspiracy theories and paranoia. I mean, I think there is something special in the way that Americans think. Here's just my speculative thought on this. You know, I think that American life, if you look especially at if you look at classic American art, in particular fiction, novels, and even painting, you will see a lot of loneliness, isolation, and alienation.
Mhm.
And that is both, I think, because of the big oceans between us and the rest of the world, or most of the rest of the world. And I think it's also very much kind of that classical, liberal, self-regulating individual that's at the heart of American culture and always has been.
Mhm.
Right? You're supposed to take care of yourself. You're supposed to take care of your family. You're supposed to be part of a nuclear family, not an extended family. You know, it's narrowing to the individual, which creates a whole lot of isolation. And a lot of people have said that's one of the things that set Americans apart is this individualism that can result in a lot of nights spent, I imagine, or days spent alone. And, you know, we all know this, right? All of us can probably speak to this. When we spend a lot of time alone, the world gets scarier, right? You know, the more time we are not actually in the world, the more the world gets scary. So does that, I mean, I can't really prove this.
So let me
Go ahead. Yeah.
there's a line. I'm just gonna, I hate to quote myself, but I'm gonna
Do it.
do a better job if I just pull out the line. It's so Americans aren't distinguished by the fact that we're suspicious. We're just suspicious in distinctive ways. Every country's conspiracy stories reflect that country's culture, and that's as true of the United States as any place else. There is an American style of paranoid politics. So yes, there's a cultural distinctness, which can in some ways reflect what you're talking about. Obviously, there's a lot more going on than that, but it's not that we're more paranoid. That would just be the question of like, what kinds of fears do we have? You know,
Yeah.
because when you're put in together with other people, then you get a different set of paranoias and resentments. I mean, yeah. I guess when you, one sort of way of getting at what you were saying and what I was just reading is that we were a frontier society, you know,
Yeah.
and I talk in the book about different sort of conspiracy archetypes, and one of them I talk about is called the enemy outside, and which is sort of the idea of like someone outside your community's boundaries that wants to get in and subvert you and so either destroy you or transform you into it, subvert you and undermine you, and then you wake up and you're them. And it's but in a way that's conspicuously alien. It's different from the enemy within idea, which is the more classic pod person. You don't know who's someone who looks like you could be, you know, one of the pod people or one of the witches. This is more the idea of someone who's very clearly alien, you know, the Indian, the immigrant, or what have you, but gradually they turn your society into theirs. And I think every society that interacts with outsiders is going to develop some version of the enemy outside.
Okay.
But the version you get in a frontier society is going to be really different than the kind you get, you know, in the middle of Europe when you've had centuries of being surrounded by these guys.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
So that's what's distinctly American, and that's like, you know, chapter 2 of my book is like full of all that kind of, you know, first the Indians and then the same thing being, you know, being rerun with, you know, Germans during World War I, you know, Muslims during the War on Terror, and so on. But yeah, I mean, so that is distinctly American. I just don't think that I would not want to claim that Americans are more paranoid than Europeans. You know, and I can say there's one criticism a couple people have had of my book is they say, why don't you say more about anti-Semitism? Which I do have. I mean, there are plenty of anti-Semites in the book. I don't downplay it at all. But it's true that I don't say as much about it as I do about anti-Black racism, anti-Indian racism, and anti-Catholic. Because, I mean, so much of early American history reflects, you know, tensions between Protestant and Catholic European powers.
Mm-hmm.
If I were writing about Europe, obviously anti-Semitism would be right at the core of it.
Yeah.
There's a reason why that's where the Holocaust happened, as opposed
Right.
to if I were writing about the Middle East, it would be at the center of it. In this book, it's obviously a part of it, and I don't downplay it at all. But I mean, that's just sort of an example of these kind of. I mean, different societies find different scapegoats and different people to fear in different degrees.
Yeah, sure. And of course, like the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, the most famous ones in history and the most destructive for sure. And there have been plenty like that in other countries. I'm sure in India, there are all kinds of conspiracy theories that have led to the mass deaths of Muslims and Hindus and everyone else. But listen to this, though. In the United States, we have had famous conspiracy theories that changed policy and changed American history. Concerning witches, Chinese men drugging and kidnapping white women and enslaving them in sex rings. We've had 2 conspiracy hysterias about communists in the 1910s and the 1950s.
More than 2.
Well, at least 2. Two big ones. That's right. We can get back to that in a second. We had I think you mentioned it before, the satanic panic, preschool ritual abuse panic of the 1980s and 90s. So we had like preschool teachers who were Satanists, apparently. This is the one criticism I had of your book, and I told you about it at the time. I think you do very little on the very, very rich, and I like it, very rich history of African-American conspiracy theories, which we can talk about. And they have all kinds, mostly about the government, like giving the ghetto aids and bringing in, and chemtrails spraying chemicals over the hood.
We do discuss that, though. I mean, I do have the.
It's in there.
I mean, I go back to like folklore in the days of slavery, and then I mean, there's this whole kind. I mean, you mentioned AIDS. There's this whole series of Black conspiracy theories about white medical establishment and white doctors for very understandable reasons, because there's a long history of white doctors mistreating Black people. I mean, Tuskegee would be like the famous example of a real conspiracy, but also just being mistreated. I mean, it's I mean, like when you're in a situation where one group can consistently treat another group in a high-handed way, that's going to reflect the way people think of in the second group, think of the first group. But like there's these ideas of so-called night doctors who are kidnapping Black people in order to do experiments and steal parts of their body, and it's actually unclear like to what extent some of this may have been true. It's very hard to tell. This is actually something else that happens in here. Is like this is not. I should stress to people, this is not a debunking book. I do some debunking when things come up, but I really set out just to tell the history of these stories and of these fears, but not to like share my views on which ones are true or not. But one reason it has to be like that is, especially with some of these old stories, you really can't tell. It's these night doctor stories, some of it is pretty clearly just folklore fears, but they could be rooted in something more than just they've been mistreated by. I mean, there definitely were cases of slaves, and even after slavery, Black people being experimented on in ways that were not meet proper standards of consent. So
we also, sorry, quickly, we also know.
Go ahead.
In this case, we also know for a fact that Margaret Sanger and W.E.B. Du Bois wanted to put birth control into Harlem and other Black neighborhoods specifically to limit the Black population, which they found to be genetically inferior to others. This was including W.E.B. Du Bois, the very famous Black social scientist. So Black people in this country have a lot of reason to be nervous about institutions like Planned Parenthood, which was founded by Margaret Sanger. So, but I don't think Planned Parenthood is snatching Black babies out of homes, but I do know for a fact that it was founded in part to do essentially, in effect, that to snatch Black babies out of the population.
Eugenics was a mainstream American belief, but that's not a conspiracy 100 years ago. I mean, this was just something people talked about openly. It was believed to be part of what a good progressive believed.
So I'm not done yet, and my list.
Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't
And
mean
this is
to.
not. It's fine. No, and this is not
Yeah.
even close to exhaustive, as you well know. But look at all the things that Americans have been paranoid about, right? So then we could add about, what is it, about roughly a third of all Americans believe that 9/11 was an inside job, something like that.
So different polls give different numbers because they all ask the question in different ways. And of course, it was more popular when Bush was in office because, well, I mean, after he's gone, people don't care as much about blaming Bush for it. But yes, at different times, I have seen some versions of the polls where it's up around, I think, like 26%, something like that. So, yeah.
Substantial minority of Americans believe that the government was behind it in some way or another. Then we had the twin panics on campuses in the mid 2010s. So we had rapists were one, I would say, phantom that people were paranoid about. And then we had racists on campus. That was another that people were paranoid about on campuses. The Trump derangement syndrome, Russiagate. We've been afraid of communist Russians, and we've been afraid of non-communist Russians. and now recently, I have to say, I mean, it doesn't fit perfectly, but don't you agree that at least some aspects of the response to COVID has been hysterical and part of this tradition?
Well, there's you got to distinguish between conspiracy hysterias and other. Yeah. Actually, the COVID. All right, let me set aside COVID for a second.
Okay.
That's the whole topic there.
Yes.
Because you mentioned Russia, and do you agree at this moment? I feel like there's like the party of fearing Russia and the party of fearing China. And they're probably going to, meet in the middle. Like Joe Biden will probably find a way when he's president, as he will probably be, but who knows?
I was going to say
I don't know when this is going to air. I
was going to say the two parties are coming together on that, right?
Yeah, they'll be able to say, well, look, we can fear them both. Yeah,
yes.
Just like my
yes.
my general fear are all these people who are like convinced that Joe Biden is like in league with Antifa. What you got to worry about with Joe Biden, if as president, is that he will stand up in front of the country and say very gravely, we need to go after these extremists of left and right alike, and this is the bill that's going to do it. And then you look closely, and there will be stuff in there about surveillance powers and or restrictions on the right of assembly and or restrictions on the right to bear arms that affect all sorts of peaceful people who are, in addition to, whatever armed folks are worried about. I don't know when this is going to air. By the time, maybe when it's up, both Trump and Biden will have COVID and have died. So I don't know. It's,
that was a prediction about what a Biden administration would push for in terms of legislation?
That is, I wouldn't say that is a prediction per se. That is a scenario that I find very easy to see. I mean, that to me is where the dynamic is heading.
Oh yeah.
And that's, I mean, whether he could actually pass such a bill, is another matter.
Right.
But so this is not directly about COVID, but you will see why it's coming to it. Right after 9/11, I did a piece for Reason about, and some of which got recycled into the book and some of which did not. But it looked at asked the question, is this a moral panic? Clearly, we've been attacked by terrorists. Clearly, there is a real terrorist threat. But does this pass into the realm of moral panic? And this was actually the first time I, as a writer, sort of explored the sociological literature on moral panic. So I did a lot of reading. I interviewed I just wanted to get people like call up Joel Best and Philip Jenkins and these other people who write about moral panics and say, what do you think? And they gave me different answers. At what point does this become a moral panic? And the kind of conclusion I reached was that you had incidents like there's one I wrote about, and this also made its way into the book, where they thought there was this sort of jerry-rigged contraption in a mailbox in Texas, and people brought in the bomb squad, and they thought maybe this was Al-Qaeda, and it turned out to be a kid's science project, and then they still insisted on confiscating it. And that was the moment to me, like where it's like, there's understandable caution, even if it seems strange that this, small community in Texas would be their third target after after the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, but fine. But then why, when it's not a bomb, do you still feel like the police have to be the ones who carry it away? So you have things like that, or or that sort of moment. I mean, I write in the book, like everyone thinks about 9/11 paranoia, they think about the truthers, but what was much more influential and permeated society was this this moment where if somebody spilled a little sugar in at the gate in an airport and someone notices it, a couple hours later they would shut down an entire wing of the airport because they thought it might be anthrax. So at the same time, so I'm writing about this kind of does fit in a lot of ways the sort of classic structure of a moral panic, even though there is a real terrorist threat, which 3,000 people's families could tell you about. But at the same time, a lot of things that people were sort of tutting about in the press, people buying Cipro, or I think that was the name of the drug that was supposed to be like, or people like training with firearms. That looked to me more like sort of like a spontaneous civil defense kind of thing. I mean, people didn't know, people were not sure how big a threat they were, and they were sort of making as rational a move as they could to make sense of what was going on and to be prepared. And I was not really comfortable calling that panic. And I think that sort of has to do also with this kind of mistaken belief that people typically panic after, during natural disasters, when in fact, since the early 60s, there's been like a lot of studies by disaster sociologists that have shown that this conventional wisdom is wrong, that there's a lot of spontaneous cooperation.
Yes.
And it's almost like the opposite of panicking.
Yes.
If anything, there's sometimes, like the evacuation of the Twin Towers was actually amazingly smoothly done, this sort of bottom up, anarchic, but cooperative, a procedure. And if anything, there's sometimes people don't act quickly enough because they're so calm and they're so willing to, step back and and not stampede. And I think that's, a lot of the stuff is just sort of normal cooperative behavior. And even when it turns out to be wrong, I'm not going to dismiss people for doing it. So COVID, I'm coming back to COVID. There's been a lot of institutional responses that were, like some of the ludicrous rules that they enacted in Michigan, where they were closing off, certain aisles of stores because they didn't want to do in-store purchases, but that just meant people were going to crowd more in the other aisles,
right.
Or imposing curfews, which was just idiotic. When they started, and this was before they imposed lockdowns, but when they started talking about, social distancing and we didn't know how bad things would be, I started doing my grocery shopping late at night. There'd be fewer people there, and it seemed like the polite pro-social thing to do. And I tend to be a night owl anyway, and the idea that you want to sort of compel more people to get, it's like this kind of idea of you think you're imposing order, but you're actually imposing disorder, So I agree that kind of institutional response is really misguided, and kind of, whether it's not about a conspiracy thinking, but it's in that same sort of frame you're talking about.
How about hysterical?
But what I want to say is I don't like it when people say you're being hysterical if you're wearing a mask out. That's like such an easy precaution for someone to take, for most people to take. And it's polite, if someone is asked you to, I think that people will go around mask shaming people are being assholes, and they're really more into it for their own feelings of self-righteousness than for, but I also think that people who are like going into a store where they posted a sign clearly saying wear a mask and they throw a tantrum are also being assholes.
Sure. Yeah. Agreed.
And I think this kind of reflects, to me, the most disturbing thing about sort of the mass, I'm not talking about the institutions, but ordinary people's reactions to COVID. And I don't think this is true of most people, but like when it does pop up in those ways, it's these culture warriors that have to turn everything into part of the culture war. And they have to, the sorts of people who just love being on Twitter or Facebook, posting a photograph of someone they disapprove of, and they say, if they can have a chance to do that in person and pat themselves on the back, they love that. And so that kind of thing is disturbing to me. I don't think that's most people, but it aggravates. I hear enough anecdotes from people I know. One of my colleagues was on a bike without a mask on because he's riding a bike. He's not going to breathe on anybody, and also he's going to be, you know, he's riding a bike. He wants to be able to breathe well. You know, if there's any activity where if both you want to and you're not doing any harm by doing it without a mask, it's riding a bike. And he passes someone, and she had a mask, and she took it off and deliberately coughed on him as he passed. And he said, "What do you do that?" It says, "That's because that's how much respect you have." Blah blah blah. And but I hate to but then I feel like I'm nitpicking because now I'm like pointing at these people and shaming them, and I don't even want to do that. I mean, we can get. I mean, this is a whole other topic, the culture war, and how I kind of feel like these culture warriors who are like with us or against us, and I feel like they're all on one side. It's like the culture warriors against the rest of us. Like they hate each other, but it's like they're like a group of Sneetches, and some have stars and some don't, and then there are all the people who aren't Sneetches. And this is like the worst metaphor I've ever come up with, Thad. You've inspired it.
That's what I do here.
And we have to put up with them insisting that, our quirky, eccentric behaviors, fit into one of their boxes or the other, and they're going to find some excuse to berate us. And that's not at all an answer to your question, was it?
No. That was that was terrible evasion. No, I mean, it was a fascinating answer, but it wasn't directly. No, I
think I covered your answer and then kept going in some other direction.
In music, Jesse, it's called a riff. I mean, that's all it was a beautiful riff. No, and it's not even that important because I'm not even sure my question's that important. But I was getting at what you do with, and you started to answer this, what you do with the word hysteria and whether you think that is applicable with the COVID response, with anything else. I mean, where is there ever hysteria in American politics that you see? Do you like that term, or you do not like that term, or what do you do with that term?
I don't usually use that term. I mean, I don't like to, although I'm a hypocrite because my book has the word paranoia in the title, but I don't like this sort of pathologizing. I haven't in the book. I apologize for using the term. I mean, it's kind of, I say I'm not using this in a clinical way, and I am applying it to everybody, including you, me, and the founding fathers. So I'm very much trying not to do the kind of Richard Hofstadter paranoid style thing.
Right.
Actually, Hofstadter also clarified he didn't mean it in a clinical way, although he kind of made it feel like he was doing it anyway. I'm not, but like the Fact magazine. Trying to diagnose Goldwater from afar, all that. I hate that kind of stuff. So I'm sure I've used the word hysteria, but at different times. But it tends to be used in a kind of dismissive way that I'm not. I mean, I dismiss things, but I don't know. It's just not part of my usual vocabulary.
I just see it as such a fundamental part of American politics, especially kind of rank and file politics, if that makes sense. Populist politics in this country tend to almost always be hysterical. I find, and I'm gonna say even on my side of issues, I think, I feel as righteous as hell when I'm anti-war, but I know that a lot of anti-war people, anti-imperialist people, exaggerate stuff to get their arguments across, but I don't think they lie necessarily. I think, and I have seen myself do this occasionally, there's something triggered in us. And by the way, Hofstadter's argument, which you mentioned earlier, one of his arguments that you and I both like, is that he says that conspiracy theories and this way of thinking tends to be an act of projection. You're projecting both your ideals, or often is you're projecting like yourself, or I guess you're projecting fears about yourself. Is that his argument onto others?
I mean, that often, you wind up yes, I think that would be fair. But he also goes on to talk about how sometimes groups will structure themselves after what they imagine the other group to be. Yeah, and also, and then when you get into, when you inject sex into it, you can get some really interesting projection. I mean, you read like some of the tracts about Mormons in the 19th century. It's clear. It's like, you have people imagining what they would do if they could have multiple partners,
Oh,
and
yeah.
reading that into the Mormon world,
Yeah.
so yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that reminds me, by the way, of the anti-pornography movement of the 1980s, the feminist anti-porno and Christian anti-pornography movement, and how Andrea Dworkin would describe porn in this luscious detail, and it was very clear she was getting off on it. But a lot of anti-porn people have done that too. Which, and by the way, that's another conspiracy theory, right? I mean, it was this porn industry which is enslaving these women. They're doing it against their will. No one's talking about it. Linda Lovelace was actually tortured. Blah blah blah. I think there is something American. I don't know. I speculated as to the cause of it, but that we tend to get especially emotionally exercised about politics, which is odd because we know so little about politics. But maybe that's why. Maybe that's the answer. Is that, again, back to my original argument, that it's the ignorance about politics, I think, I'm guessing, that tends to make Americans especially crazy about politics.
Well, I don't know that other countries are all that less ignorant in practice,
No.
but I mean, but there's an ignorance about what goes on in the other side. I mean, this is actually, and this is probably true of you too, because since I participate in different political subcultures, or I have ties there without being a part of them. I'm often immune to certain kinds of projection, because I know, I mean, I've spent enough time among conservatives and enough time among leftists to know that the conservative idea of what leftists are like and vice versa is often just wildly off. But also that they often project similar things onto each other. I mean, there's even like sometimes, there, you spend any time in that kind of political circle, you will eventually get to the point where you hear someone saying, we're too nice and they play mean. And we've got to learn to play mean the way they do. I've heard this again and again from both the left and the right. Some people hate the phrase both sides because they hate anything that touches their side. I hate the phrase both sides because it implies there's just two sides. I think this is just sort of like a universal thing, that it's like any sort of group that has like a sustained opposition to another group must eventually start saying this, that that other group always plays mean. It's time for some new rules and just show them a taste of their own medicine. And because they spend so little time in the other tribes' circles, they don't know that the people there are saying the exact same thing. I mean, often with the exact same language. Right. And to me, it's like, it's not something like both sides do it. It's like people do it. This seems to be a typical thing that, especially when you're kind of cut off from what's happening in that other tribe.
Yeah. All right. I'm gonna now grill you again. Our original beef that started this whole conversation. But first, I want to. You said something about there were 3 Red Scares. So I mentioned the Red Scare of the 1910s, which resulted in the deportation.
Well, there's the two that people talk about. Yeah. There's the one that sort of begins in the teens and stretches into 20s, like with the Red Raids, and there's the McCarthy era.
Right.
But there were, I mean, I think Red Scare is a fair term for what happened in the 1870s in the wake of the Paris Commune, and then sort of stretching up to like, the railroad strike. And then there's also one sort of in the 1880s. So this is, before there's, people say you don't always call them Red Scares because it's before there's a Bolshevik Revolution, right. But I think they kind of fit the same thing. And there's also the Brown Scares, which are the fears of the far right.
Yeah.
There was a big Brown Scare, obviously, in the Nazi era. And I mean, when a lot of people who were not fascist sympathizers were tagged as fascist sympathizers, and this is a way that a lot of liberals got behind new powers of surveillance. Voting to renew the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which they turned around to bite them on the ass. Yeah. And then there was another Brown Scare in the early '60s, which is what part of the context for the paranoid style in American politics.
That was a reaction to the JFK assassination, right?
It precedes that. It kind of it was going on in the early '60s, and then it kind of went into overdrive with the assassination. But it kind of set the when you had people saying, Dallas killed Kennedy, and it's sort of the this is what you get when you have this kind of Bircher and Minuteman rhetoric. That sort of created the mindset that mindset had been created by all this coverage of the radical right, and which then kind of got a twist when it turned out Oswald, had defected to the Soviet Union and so on. And then there's another brown scare in the 1990s around the militias.
Yeah. Oh yeah, right.
And that was part of what got me interested. You were asking me at the beginning what got me interested in this. I mean, I was interested in the militia worldview, and I was interested, in their conspiracy theories, but I was also interested in, it would seem clear to me that there were conspiracy theories about the militias, especially after the Oklahoma City bombing. Timothy McVeigh was not, as far as we know, a member of a militia. There was a story that he had been sort of a bodyguard to a guy in the Michigan militia, but that was probably a person named McKay, not McVeigh, and there was sort of a lost translation. But there was there was a big surge of it then, and then so that's, the brown scares and the red scares have sort of traded off, and sometimes they happen kind of simultaneously, and that's kind of what I'm predicting with, I guess, if it's a prediction with Joe Biden, if he becomes president, deciding that the extremes of left and right alike need to be brought to heel.
Two things. Right. One is that what do you think of the theory that the FBI very likely had something to do with the Oklahoma City bombing?
So,
speaking of conspiracy theories, right?
So I do not blame the FBI for the Oklahoma City bombing, but I do think, when people ask me, people love to ask me what conspiracy theories you believe in, and I, in general, believe in so little. Everything is a matter of probabilities for me, and a lot of the conspiracies that I firmly believe in are ones that other people believe in, so they don't call them conspiracy theories. But the two that I have the most suspicions about are the Malcolm X assassination, which was a conspiracy. There are multiple gunmen, but I think it is thinkable by me that there were police with advanced knowledge that was going to happen. And it is thinkable by me that Timothy McVeigh, who was plugged into that whole sort of network around Aloha City and so on, had more co-conspirators than just Nichols.
Right.
Now it is clearly the case that world had been infiltrated by the feds. So the question then becomes, do you think they were behind it, or do you think this was just an immense case of incompetence, that they didn't know they were infiltrated and didn't notice McVeigh? I find the incompetence theory very plausible, or at least plausible enough that I'm not going to sit here and make accusations about the Oklahoma City bombing. But yeah, J.M. Berger has done some great work on that whole infiltration of the radical right and those circles that McVeigh was moving through, and makes a good case for the incompetence theory. But even if you don't buy into the incompetence theory, it's worth reading the stuff he's written, because there's a whole. It's clearly the case that a lot was happening there that people don't know as well. There was like this group called the Aryan Republican Army, and their leader was like a cross-dresser, and had this. I read this account of this recruitment video where he's like got painted nails, and I so want to see this video, and like load it online and do like one of my Friday AV Club posts about it. But I've never actually like found a copy out there. I just read this journalist account of it. But like McVeigh was intersecting with that, and it's just, there's this whole 90s universe.
Okay, so you missed another brown scare though, obviously, the one that began in 2016.
Well, there's one that began with the Tea Party movement.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah,
that's right. Yet another one. There's been several, right?
Yeah, at this point, they're just kind of coming, one after another,
right,
and overlapping with the Red Scares and so on. Yeah.
So wait, all right. I have a few more questions for you, but I'm gonna challenge you again. So your book came out in 2013. And a couple of years later, I said that I was implying in my tweet that we are living in an especially hysterical time in American history. And you said, haven't we always been? Don't you think that since your book came out in 2013, 7 years ago, that the United States has in fact entered a period, you kind of just said this, of it's an exceptional time. I don't remember the 90s. We certainly had a few in the 90s. We had the McMartin preschools case. We had the Vince Foster stuff on the right wing, claiming Clintons were killing people, for sure. But for one thing, those didn't result in mass marches in the streets, right? That didn't result in people talking about civil war. That didn't result in, the entire media basically calling for war against the entire administration and vice versa. So, I mean, don't you think, like, since your book came out,
So
it's accelerated, maybe because of your book?
Yeah, I'm to blame, clearly.
Yes.
There's been, so a year after my book came out, another book came out by Joe Yasinski and Joe Parent called American Conspiracy Theories. They're a couple of political scientists.
Okay.
Good guys. I mean, definitely worth reading.
Okay.
And what's sort of fascinating at what they did is they did they methodically looked at every letter to the editor in the New York Times from the 1890s up to, I think, 1910. I mean, up to I think 2010, thereabouts. And also sort of a sample, not a complete sample, but like just sort of a control group from the Chicago Tribune, and methodically counted and categorized every letter that made a conspiratorial claim.
Okay.
It was the first sort of big data attempt to look at how common conspiracy thinkings are at different times. And obviously, you can challenge how good a proxy that is, but it's better than anything anyone came up with before, because we were just sort of playing it by ear. And it's especially hard sometimes for someone like me who's swimming in fringe stuff to know how much this is, being noticed by people outside the fringe, And so they found two huge spikes in the 1890s around the corporate trusts, and in the 1950s around, McCarthyism and the early Cold War. They found some smaller spikes too, like Watergate obviously had one. They generally found that there was not but if you sort of like averaged it all out, there was kind of a steady level and a slight decline. A lot of things that people assumed that they would be steadily increasing, or that, like when the internet comes along, it takes off. They did not find it all. And Joe Yasinski also does polling regularly, and he will talk about how things are not taking off to the extent people think they are. He's very good at sort of cooling down people's like fears that like everyone is into QAnon or something like that. Now so I'm used to sort of pointing to that on top of my work and saying it's always like this. I am willing to concede that if they continue till today, they would probably find in the Trump era another spike. Okay.
It is.
I think those spikes happen.
There it is.
And I certainly feel, as a matter of intuitive anecdote and so on, that we are living through one right now.
Thank you.
But I have to say, because you're not doing this, but at least half the people who ask me about that, they think it's about the internet. They think it's about social media. They're inclined to blame things that I do not at all. I mean, the internet changes conspiracy theories in a lot of different ways, but it doesn't create them. It doesn't really increase them, other than in the way that it speeds up the production and disposal of them,
Yeah, right.
But yes, I do feel like if they were to like do a follow-up study, it's very likely that they would find another spike starting around 2015 or 16, and continuing to now.
I'd say so.
It's plausible.
Good. I think it's possible. I think it's probable.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. I mean, so okay, do Russiagate. Tell us about Russiagate. Where do you put this? If your book went through the 2010s, what would you say about Russiagate in it?
So I'm glad my book doesn't go through the 2010s, first of all. The worst chapter of my book is it's like the post 9/11 one, because it's the one where I felt like I was trying to squeeze in everything that happened in the last 10 years. And so it got a little formless, or at least risked formlessness. Hopefully I overcame that. But my God, if I tried to include all the Trump stuff, it would just go off the cliff. It'd be, and then. But yeah, so at this point, the big Russiagate narrative is pretty much, dissolved. It's very hard to make a serious case for it. Parts of the Russiagate narrative are true. I mean, it's like, Paul Manafort's a sleazeball, I mean, they did try these propaganda campaigns on Facebook, although I don't think they had much impact.
No.
So I don't, but the larger one, went up being bullshit. And I wrote a piece for the LA Times in 2017 or 18. It just sort of made the case for like how to keep your head and look at because I try to be open-minded. corruption happens, conflicts of interest happen.
Mhm.
I'm sure Trump and his allies have lots of conflicts of interest all over the world. Could very easily be some in Moscow, you know. And one of the sort of bits of advice I had, and I was sort of stealing a metaphor from Robert Anton Wilson, to sort of try not to mistake spaghetti for an octopus. You know, you can see like a mess of tentacles in this lump in the middle, and think there's like this one big head with all these tentacles controlling things, and that head might be Putin, and all these things it's touching are his puppets.
Right.
And in fact, what you have is a meatball, you know, and surrounded by all these things that are interlinked, often in conspiratorial and criminal ways, sometimes in completely innocent ways. But it's like all these sort of micro conspiracies that intersect with each other that is part of ordinary politics. But if you're really intent on sort of creating a narrative where there's like a big puppet master, you can focus on one big figure who's part of that whole mess. I mean, Putin is, of course, involved in various conspiracies. He's a head of state,
Sure.
And a rather authoritarian state at that.
Yeah.
And you can then sort of try to then sort of project all these things onto it. And I really sort of feel like after the election, people who didn't see how they could lose, especially lose to this guy, this idiot.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that they saw him as an idiot, but let's be frank, he's an idiot. He is, you know. How does this happen? And it's so much easier to sort of find someone to project things onto. And the two big villains, which of course got linked together, were Russia and social media. Because you can always be two things you can always do, especially, or certainly you can always do in America, can't speak for Finland, or blame foreigners and blame strange new technologies.
Right.
Especially if you're in one of the older technologies.
That's right.
Very easy for people in TV and newspapers to, you know, go after Facebook.
That's right.
Which I have a ton of problems with Facebook, but I don't think swinging the election is one of them.
Right.
And I think that, and so what you then had sort of emerging is this conventional wisdom, because people would look at, you know, saying Russia's strategy is to find the chasms in our society or not find the cracks and turn them into chasms. That's sort of a half-baked, half-remembered quote from some congressman or another. And but what I sort of saw was Russia finding where there were already chasms and then just sort of, you know, jumping over there and waving and, you know, adding a little bit to it, adding a little bit more noise to the din. I'm mixing metaphors again. And but I don't really think that these you know, Facebook memes really had much impact. And there was this whole moment when people like were doing these stories about demonstrations that were organized by, you know, Russians would set up these social media groups to organize real life demonstrations, and it was sort of treated as this big you know, big spooky thing that people were actually out in the streets because of Russia.
Right.
Now, in fact, most of these demonstrations, they have like 4 people. It's like nothing, you know. I mean, there was some where nobody showed up. There was one where they found, there was like some Texas secession thing. They had like a few dozen or whatever it was. And people were saying, wow, you got that many people. And then I just went and looked up how many people went to a Texas secessionist event in the 90s, and it was several hundred, you know. Right. It's, you know, and then that's when Boris Yeltsin was in charge of Russia and presumably was not interested in, you know, encouraging Texas. And the one sort of big demonstration that was linked to them, it was in New York. I think it was right after the inauguration, but it was like at a time when there were a ton of anti-Trump demonstrations, and it was just one of them. And they had a lot of people, and it was done. The group the sort of fake group that organized it was called something like Black Matters. So they sort of, you know, it looked like Black Lives Matter. And it was, and I say, so fine. You find a time when lots of people are already marching and you adopt the name of a famous and fairly popular group. And yeah, you're able to join the din a little bit, but you haven't accomplished any. And I thought, I tried to like sort of check myself. I always try to check myself on these things. And I said, so what could they accomplish maybe from this? Could they perhaps recruit sources, you know, or like spies or something? And I think they could do that at any rally. They don't have to organize a rally. That's actually more suspicious if you wanted to like try to, you know, recruit people to work for for it. So I say this as someone I'm not saying this in a partisan way. I actually thought the Ukraine scandal was a legitimate scandal. The one they wound up impeaching him for. I'd say, that was not something he should have done. But it's like I just really think that the Russiagate scandal was it's like they saw, and this is the projection thing again. They saw a paranoid nationalist rise to power, and they had to react to it by finding their own form of paranoid nationalism.
Oh,
And as someone who doesn't like nationalism, period,
right,
paranoid or not, but the paranoid, I mean, when people ask me what kind of conspiracy theories do I not like, because I think a lot of them are harmless, or amusing, but like the ones that scapegoat people are the ones that are dangerous, or especially dangerous. And the nationalist ones are particularly prone to doing that. And I'm really not happy to see everyday Russians and now everyday Chinese people being hassled because of these political fears.
nice.
These essentially domestic, but people don't like to accept how much conflict is always a part of American society, and so they want to sort of imagine that some sort of foreign supervillain is behind it. And maybe sometimes people notice the conflict for the first time because it's in their face. I mean, this talk about civil war, which I also don't buy into. It's not like there's two sides here. We're heading towards obviously greater violence and conflict, but like sort of levels of violence and conflict we've seen lots of times in American history. Like in the 1960s and 70s, or the Reconstruction, other times that are much more sort of comparable than Civil War. But people, it's like we've lived through a time of relative social peace, and I mean, since the early 80s. I mean, compared to earlier parts of American history, certainly that period that sort of bookended by Oswald and Hinckley, and people got used to that, and they got used to like not seeing the various conflicts that were running on underneath the surface, that maybe were not manifesting themselves as traditional Democrat versus Republican, red versus blue conflicts. So when they spring into view, they go looking for a scapegoat. They must be Putin, not something that's been part of this society all along.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned the 60s and 70s, and this is going to be my final question, or it's something I want to do with you. I think it's been really useful. Been thinking about this. I want to catalog as best we can. I mean, it's a very long list. I want to catalog right now a list of conspiracies we know are actually true or were true. Right. And I want to talk about like the most outlandish ones, because it's important for people to know, isn't it, that there have been real conspiracies, usually by government actors, that have been wild sounding but turned out to be true and had tremendous consequences. So why don't you name a couple, and maybe I'll name a couple. We'll go back and forth and just like see if we can come up with a decent accounting of the actual amazing conspiracies that were real.
Yeah, and just to be clear, we're talking about conspiracies that were real, not conspiracy theories that were real.
Correct.
Because most of these, occasionally you have a conspiracy theory that then they say, I mean, a good example would be the Nixon intervening, or the Nixon campaign intervening in the peace talks in 1968,
right,
in order to not have an October surprise and be able to to help pursue his election. That was seen as a conspiracy theory, and now I think most historians of that period say it's probably true, right?
Yeah.
So but usually it's more like it comes out and it's like nobody thought that was going on. Like, I mean, if there were people who thought MK Ultra was going on before it was revealed, this being the
do MK Ultra.
The CIA effort to sort of, well, there's a lot to it, but we will just say, for example, in the interest of fears of communist brainwashing and wanting to be able to resist that, wondering if psychedelic drugs could be of use, and then surreptitiously administering it to people without their consent, and recording what happened, in some cases fucking up people's lives. I mean, one guy famously, because there was just a Errol Morris documentary about it, killed himself. And Errol Morris thought there might have been more going on. I don't know if he made as good a case as he could have, maybe. But that's certainly one. And then another one would be Cointelpro, which is actually, this is a tricky one, because so Cointelpro involved the FBI deliberately not just infiltrating to spy on dissident groups, infiltrating to make them afraid of each other, to snitch jacket people, to break up groups, to break up marriages, even. It was Cointelpro that you might, if you go online and Google this, you can find this Black Panther comic book. I mean, not comic book, coloring book, which was not produced by the Black Panthers. It was produced by the FBI. I mean, attributed to the Panthers, and it's all this kind of gruesome, kill whitey stuff. Have you seen this, Thad?
No, I've never seen this.
Look it up.
I will.
Would love this thing.
Wow.
I mean, it's like a cartoon. It's like, the 1960s version of Gateway Pundits, idea of what the Black Panthers were doing. But of course, the reason they were doing Cointelpro was because they thought, it began with going after people they believed were the puppets of the Soviet Union. And then they sort of expanded to these other groups. And one way they expanded it, by the way, was by getting liberals aboard by saying, we're going to go after the Klan, which is interesting.
They did. But they did go after the Klan.
Yeah, they did. But that then sort of helped set the stage for going after the New Left and the Panthers.
Yeah.
But at any rate, so they were afraid. It was basically a government conspiracy to combat subversive conspiracies by convincing the conspirators that they were being conspired against. So there were so many different mirrors pointing at each other there in terms of both real and false conspiracies, that it's kind of hard to get your head around it. And if you want to just sort of have fun with this stuff, old Cointelpro files are now up at FBI.gov. I download. I tell stories in here that I just found from reading them.
Wow.
Operations they did. And that's now just online for people to look at.
Wow.
You will find some oddities.
Wow.
All right. So there's two right there. Three, I guess. Nixon, MK Ultra, and Cointelpro. You probably want to throw in a few.
I love that one. I mean, I love all those. Yeah, that's really good stuff. Yeah, if you don't think the government is capable of outlandish stuff, conspiracies, then you're wrong. So for me, the biggest conspiracy in American history, possibly in world history, happened in the late 1930s and early 1940s, which is when the United States, about a couple dozen men in the federal government, decided the fate of the world. I mean, so they were making plans in secret, and we know this, they deliberately was in secret, for how they were going to win the war, fight the war, and divide up the world, after the war, once they were the superpower. And this was the Council on Foreign Relations writing blueprints for basically how the United States was going to do all this. And they said right then, we must keep this a secret. They said it in 1939 until the end of the war. And lo and behold, 1945, they got basically everything they wanted. They got a form of world government in the United Nations and the IMF and World Bank, et cetera, et cetera. And the United States was, of course, the dominant superpower. And they divvied up Europe the way they figured they would with the Soviet Union, et cetera. So, I mean, and that, again, so from 1939 to 1945, there was a small group of a couple dozen men in New York City and Washington, D.C., deciding the fate of the world that we live in, basically shaping the world that you and I live in now. So I think it was a pretty big conspiracy that was totally true. And the only people who called it that were the so-called isolationists of the time, who were completely discredited by not discredited, they were ostracized by 1941, late 1941. So I mean that tends not to go under conspiracy theories, because that's just sort of like foreign policy. But I mean, governments making grand plans in secret, I think, is sort of the definition of a conspiracy, and the kind of conspiracy we want to be most afraid of, right?
Although a lot of that stuff is not done in secret. I mean, that's the
when
I see people talking about trilateral commission, it's like, I don't think there's a trilateral conspiracy, but
that's right.
I think the trilateral commission produced a number of papers that shows their worldview, and it's a very elitist worldview, and you can what was the phrase? The problem of democracy. Or people talk about the Bilderberg group as a conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy. It's a ruling class institution. People get together once a year. I guess they probably skipped it this year, and they meet and they have they interact. And it's not that it is the secret parliament where things are planned. It's one of the places where it's almost like if there are, within a local ruling class, these people might meet frequently at a country club. It's not like that country club rules the county or whatever.
Right.
It's one of their gathering places, and that's
right.
And a lot of conspiracy theories are these kind of exaggerated. They will zero in on something like Bilderberg or the Bohemian Grove, and they will turn it into a Pulp Fiction narrative, and there will be like this sort of core of truth to it, you know. I mean, important political decisions have been made at Bohemian Grove meetings. Meeting between Nixon and Reagan, and whichever year in the '60s it was, you know. But you know, again, it's not that this is like some sort of pagan cult at Bohemian Grove that rules the world, right, or whatever Alex Jones version of it you want to look at. It's right, more like this is social groups have institutions. They exist in a concrete form in our human society. And there are factions within those institutions too. I mean, it's not like you were mentioning the Council on Foreign Relations earlier. Not everybody who's been a member of the Council on Foreign Relations has subscribed to that kind of worldview, because a lot of people just join because they teach political science at Georgetown and it's the thing to do, or what have you. But it's an important institution for generating an American foreign policy.
Yeah, I'd say a lot of the biggest conspiracies have been what I call open conspiracies. So like let's take the neoconservatives who pushed the country to war against Iraq, right? Well, they published a document with their vision and what they wanted to see in the world 2 years before 9/11. What was it? Rebuilding America's defenses. I think it was 99 or 2000. PNAC. Yeah, I think in 2000, right? Before any of this stuff jumped off, right?
I don't remember which year, but yeah.
It was before 9/11. It was well before 9/11.
And they had a social vision, and it was, and the thing is, like, after 9/11, there was this sort of moment where every group found a way to argue that 9/11 demonstrated that what they had always wanted was what they wanted to do. Right? I mean, if you wanted to subsidize this industry, well, 9/11 proved that. If you wanted to invade Iraq, well, it proved that. These people happen to be very well connected in the Bush administration, so theirs was the program that a great deal of, I mean, we can't say was fully enacted because, of course, it did not work out the way they expected it would. But that's another matter.
But they announced it, and then they did it. They didn't keep anything really secret at all, ever. I don't think, including their intentions for the United States as a global hegemon. One of the things I really like about you and your work, and this is on a psychological level, your work and your way of thinking really calms me down. You tend to be the guy, a lot of people at Reason do this too, but I think you're kind of the best at it. Like you tend to be the guy to sort of say, hey, everybody's freaking out about this or that political phenomenon right now, but here's 5 or 10 reasons why it's happened before, or, it's probably not, the consequences are not going to be so great. I mean, you have some temperament about you that leads you to think.
Yeah, I mean,
I appreciate that.
Well, thank you, because I worry that's, that I can fall into that as a formula and miss something important that should be scaring me.
and then we have World War III. Thanks, Jesse. Yeah.
Yeah. You should have been preparing, and I didn't. Can I say, you were asking about me and libertarianism earlier?
Yeah.
Can I say something about that? Because
sure.
When we none of the people watching this will know it because your editor is excellent, but we turned off the camera so I could refill my water, at a moment earlier. And if you've been sort of Zapruder style, analyzing it, you would notice it got high up in the glass again. But I found myself thinking about that while I did that. And I sort of, my libertarianism, or what you want to call libertarianism, it kind of comes from this productive tension between pluralism and anti-authoritarianism, which are two very important values to me that are not fully aligned. They don't contradict each other, but there's if you're a serious pluralist, there's going to be like religious communities that are kind of authoritarian and hierarchical. And if you're like a serious anti-authoritarian, that's going to maybe undermine some of the pluralism and I think, but again, I don't think it's a contradiction. I think there's sort of, if you have kind of an open society in which people are able to move out of communities and so on, and revolt within communities and interact with one another, you can have these things playing off each other in a way that is neither smoothing down all the cultural diversity of pluralism nor propping up these hierarchies. Why am I saying this, which sounds so completely, because it's like, this is, to me, is like, it's very different from your standard precepts and deduce everything and come up with the way society should be run, and then figure out then get everyone on board and you impose it, which is never how anything, I mean, or hardly any actual societies are built, other than like, communes or something, like large scale societies. And if there's something that sort of frustrates me about the libertarian world, it's the sort of, there are a lot of people who, or there's a number of people, I shouldn't say a lot, because a lot of people sort of intuitively do kind of grasp what you do and I do, and others sort of in our kind of sphere of thinking like this do. But they don't appreciate why. Let's say, why are you writing about this weird bit of cultural history that's not kind of doesn't necessarily have an obvious lesson for policy or philosophy or whatever. And it's because, I mean, this is the way social change often happens. And I think if you believe in both pluralism and anti-authoritarianism, you want to see how they play out and how they interact with each other. And you just kind of want to watch this process happen from, at the grassroots. And you want policies that will let it happen. I mean, let it happen in a nonviolent way, and have the framework. It just, and this kind of speaks to what you're saying about, well, I mean, it's not necessarily subaltern, but it's happening a lot of times out of view of mainstream policymakers. And it relates to conspiracy theories, because this kind of interaction this is where the folklore is generated. I mean, it's people see a feminist revolution. I don't mean feminist with a capital F. I mean just sort of greater women's liberation. Like, those are really good things that have happened in this country over the last I mean, since World War II, although it's been building since before then. And they react in nervous ways, and they imagine like a plot behind it, and then they start to react to it. And feminist activists, imagine sort of a Handmaid's Tale conspiracy behind it. I mean, people are always projecting that, and you get to these like apocalyptic visions, this idea, and the ideas that maybe we're heading for a civil war or something. But it's really just this sort of messy process of negotiating new norms in the way that, I mean, ideally new norms should be negotiated by these sort of people who are kind of blindly crossing paths with each other and figuring things out, and at first being nervous, but then 30 years pass and suddenly you're working alongside a gay married guy, and you can't even remember that once you thought that was deeply scary. That's going to be how it is for trans people in 30 years. I think.
Yeah.
It's and then the flip side is it's not just that somebody forgets that they were afraid of gays. Gay people I remember in the early 90s there was an essay that people were discussing called like "I hate straight" or something like that, or "I hate straights." I think it was singular. "I hate straight." And like to that sort of withdrawal from society, that fear, but that's kind of that gets sanded away too. I mean, people, or at least if people want to withdraw from society and hate it, at least they're not necessarily doing it because they feel compelled to, because people hate them because they're gay. It's just because they're alienated in the ways everybody gets alienated. And a lot of things that and it's kind of. We live in a nation full of evangelicals who smoke pot and don't see that as a contradiction, or if they do, it's only in the way that Hank Williams would sing about both getting drunk and going to church. They manage to have it coexist in their head, and it coexists in their society. And if there's something you're saying, like me saying calm down, I think that the ultimate sort of please calm down is, don't think you're going through an apocalypse because people are learning to deal with a group of folks that look alien to them, because that's just something that's constant churn. And you know this because you write about these immigrant groups and sexual minorities and so on, and so you've seen that change over time, and you've also written about stuff that gets lost. I mean, like the great old oppositional queer culture and the stuff that produced, or unassimilated immigrant cultures, but there's always new sources of outsiders too. So I mean, that's I guess that's my ultimate, both my answer to your original stuff about my weird statement about being the please calm down guy.
Yeah, I
Even
like
though
it.
there's some things you should not be calm about because they're awful, right?
Yes. No, I like it.
Prisons and wars are bad. Okay, I'm not.
Gotcha. So the
Yeah.
Jesse Walker philosophy, I've never heard this articulated. I like it. So you're pro-pluralist and anti-authoritarian. I think so. So the United States, I think, is remarkably, probably, possibly, exceptionally pluralistic, right? We have every goddamn idea, ideology, color, ethnicity, religion here represented, right? And what you're saying, I think, is
Religion. I mean, it's
I think
like.
I said religion. Yeah, religion.
Did you have okay? Yeah, I just want to make sure everyone knows we're not just doing like the list of things that have affirmative action programs. You know, it also includes stuff despised by folks on the left side. But yes, go on.
And so there's going to be inevitable conflict among people in a society like that because they just have radically different ideas, radically different ways of behaving and living, radically different cultures. And so so you want to embrace that, let that be, and you don't want it to be regulated. That's your anti-authoritarian side of it, right? You let it go. Don't try to regulate.
The anti-authoritarian side is I am sympathetic to people who say, I don't want women to have less rights. I don't want I don't want the workplace to be strictly hierarchical. I have this very anarchistic. I mean, beyond libertarian kinds of anarchy, ideas about wanting to live in a non-hierarchical society. But I also know that it's not like you can have the anarchist police running around arresting everybody who's dominating one another. It has to be in productive tension with pluralism. And so I kind of end up with this kind of anti-utopian anarchy, I guess. But and then the institutions I hate the most are the ones that get in the way of that. I mean, like wars and prisons and
but conflict between and among cultures is fine and should be just allowed to happen without central authorities regulating them.
And the constant interplay between the cultures that ultimately diffuses conflicts or lets people live with one another without necessarily erasing all the conflict. Did you ever read Mike Royko's book Boss about Mayor Daley, the first Mayor Daley in Chicago?
No.
So I realized at some point that this was one of like those books I read in like the 7th or 8th grade that wound up influencing my outlook, in part just because it like showed this incredibly corrupt, political administration. But also there's this great passage at the beginning where he talks about Chicago as at this part in the early 20th century as this confederation of ethnic miniature states where you could always tell where you were by the languages you heard and the food you smelled and whether anyone hit you in the head with a rock. And I'm doing it from memory. I probably have it slightly wrong, but I just sort of love that kind of, on the one hand, appreciation of all these great foods and the diversity and all that. And also, it's going to lead to people beating each other up and acting like assholes. And you need to find this way to negotiate that. And, and actually one interesting way to look at, a place like Chicago is you have people like Daley who were negotiating it in a political way, but you also had someone like, Saul Alinsky, the great, speaking of conspiracy theorists, I mean, someone who was like, organizing the back of the yards and having, this, system of like, constant negotiation with all the bosses and bishops of Chicago in order to, help the neighborhoods get what they want, but doing it in this bottom-up way. And having an association was sort of built on this federative principle where all these different local organizations have a representative there. It's not like just a mass democracy. And they actually do a little bit of corrupt ballot box stuffing in order to help the people they don't like so they can get them on the inside pissing out instead of pissing in. Like that was sort of Alinsky's plot for like dealing with the folks who wanted to keep housing segregated, was we have to make them feel like they have a stake in this anti-racist but very decentralist perspective. And so, you can sort of see Alinsky and Daley as these like two different, and if you don't want to use Alinsky as an example, because obviously he's got his problems, Jane Jacobs is someone that, has that kind of neighborhood-based vision. It's I mean, that's a really appealing kind of way of looking at the world, and it's something where you can talk about radical change, but also on the level of just um, basic small scale things like we need a stop sign at this intersection. What are we going to do to get it? Well, I've gone way off whatever it was you asked me.
Quite all right.
Yeah,
I love that.
stop sign. Yeah.
It's good you brought up Saul Alinsky, so all the conspiracy theorists will go crazy with that one. Thanks for doing this. I feel like we're already in one, but I think we're entering an era of even greater, I'm afraid to say, hysteria, moral panics. And the conspiracy theories don't bother me as much. It's more the hysteria that freaks me out. But Jesse Walker will be there for all of us to keep us calm. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
This is a lot of fun. And I just really appreciate this relationship we've had. And you've been hugely helpful for my career and helping me get my word out, my ideas out there. So thanks for doing this interview, and thanks for everything you've done for me, and thanks for keeping the United States a little bit calmer.
Well, thank you for having me on, and I've enjoyed the show for a long time. I'm glad to be a part of it now.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Jesse. Yeah. All right, man. I will see you soon.
Okay.
Okay. Peace. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To join the new Renegade University, go to renegadeuniversity.com. To join the new Unregistered Underground, the supporting listeners group for the podcast, go to unregisteredunderground.com. Thanks for listening.